Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Becca Wasser, and I'm a fellow in the Defense Program and co-lead of the Gaming Lab here at a Center for New American Security. And we are back today with yet another installation of the Mission Brief, which is CNAS's new speaker series that features deep dive conversations with senior civilian and military leaders, where we try and delve into some of the really critical issues around defense strategy, operations, and force planning. The aim of this series is really to have frank conversations about what America needs to do today in order to be able to fight and win tomorrow against future adversaries and challenges that we might find ourselves facing. Today, I am so excited to be hosting Ms. Shawn Skelly, who is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Readiness, and we're going to be talking about strategic readiness. Ms. Skelly, thank you so much for being here today, and I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to have.
Thank you, Becca. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone today.
So before we get started on the good stuff, I just want to talk a little bit about what the Mission Brief series is and how it's going to unfold. So each discussion within the Mission Brief series, it's public, it's on the record, and it will be recorded. So after this event today, we're going to post the recording. So you can find it and it will be there for posterity. And each session in this series has a specific topic, and that's the mission brief for the day, if you will. So for today, we're focusing on strategic readiness. Specifically, we're trying to get after how the U.S. military is prepared to meet daily demands and things that they face on a day-to-day basis, as well as still being able to respond to emerging crises and future threats that might happen, and all of this in support of the National Defense Strategy. And so each event is going to kick off with our speaker saying what the mission brief for the day is. And then we're going to have a discussion about that. And the conversation is going to provide a little bit more detail as to the challenges that are driving the mission brief, the changes that we need to make in order to implement the mission brief and make it a reality. And after we do that, we're then going to shift to questions from the audience, you, about the mission brief. And really think of this as your opportunity to ask the really hard questions that you think senior leaders need to think about and respond to. And this is really your opportunity to shape some senior leader thinking. To submit your questions, please use the question and answer function in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, if you want, you can submit questions or comments on Twitter by using hashtag CNAS 2021. I will note that you do need to say your full name in order for your question to be used. We're not going to be taking anonymous questions just as a matter of principle. So let's get started on the fun stuff now that that is out of the way. Let's go with what our question of the day is. Ms. Skelly, what is today's mission brief?
Becca, strategic readiness is the Department of Defense's ability to build, maintain, and balance warfighting capabilities and competitive advantage to ensure that the department can achieve its strategic objectives over time and threat horizons both, using tools, policies, and processes to provide senior leaders the decision advantage that they require to achieve those objectives.
A very worthy mission brief indeed. And so before we delve into talking a little bit about the challenges that are driving strategic readiness, I want to just talk a little bit about definitions because readiness is one of those issues where it's so important, but it's not terribly well understood. So would you mind sort of just letting us know your definition of readiness and perhaps describing the difference between strategic readiness and operational readiness?
Thank you, Becca. The easy one, well, whenever you talk readiness, the answer is a series of questions. Ready for what? When? Why? It seems pedantic. It seems like a parlor game, but it's not. You always have to ask those questions to construct and understand the context in which you're answering that question. Most commonly, and to this very day, the one that dominates is what we refer to as operational readiness, often construed in shorthand as ready to fight tonight. Are you ready now? And really, does that mean what are you ready to do in the next few weeks or months with the forces at hand and that have been designated to be ready to go on relatively short notice? And it takes time to create the readiness in those forces, getting them built up, getting them trained, getting them staffed, and getting equipped. And they're put on notice for that in general over a year ahead of time. And then there are all those other forces that are further behind them in their different levels of preparation to become ready eventually at some period down the line. But as we practice it today, by and large, it's operational readiness that we deal with most often. Strategic readiness is actually something we've kind of been practicing, but we just haven't really captured it as robustly as we are capturing it now and intend to pursue it with a deeper understanding. And that's really, what are we going to be ready for years down the road? 2, 3, 5, 10 years. And what does that mean in terms of how it informs what we choose to do and what we have to do, what's demanded of the department in response to the president's needs? How we do that today, what does that tell us about where we're heading in that 5 to 10 year journey?
And that's perfect, and exactly why we're talking about strategic readiness today as part of this series, because what we're doing is really trying to think about the future and how we can be more prepared for some of those future challenges, which is a great segue into talking about the challenges driving readiness. So could you talk a little bit to us about what are the top challenges that the United States faces in terms of readiness? And here I just ask that you maybe focus a little bit more on those future challenges that we think that we're going to run into.
Problem with the future is that we always have to deal with today, in the now, which we're very much living as a country today. Secretary Austin just left, I believe, is leaving any time now to go to the theater, to the part of the world that has the world's attention. And that certainly involves the Department of Defense and military forces moving towards that area in response to a looming crisis. That has a direct impact or direct consideration for us to take into account when we do move those forces and decide which ones should be ready to move, because that impacts in whole or part to some degree what we're able to do years down the line. Are any of those forces required to modernize, get new equipment? Are they designated for that? Does it impact a deployment they are expected to be ready for a little bit further down the road that may be difficult for them to be ready for by being made ready now or by actually deploying now instead of some point down the road? We're never big enough. There's always a zero-sum type decision to be made as to how much do you put into, whether that be resources, attention, people, equipment, into being ready for your responsibilities today, and how much you can set aside and put effort into preparing for tomorrow. It's always a relationship between now and down the road.
Absolutely. And I think part of what you're driving at is really because we can't be everywhere all the time doing all the things, there's a need for prioritization, or at least focusing and deciding what's most important at that juncture in time and making a bet sometimes on tomorrow. And so I think, if we're sort of reading the tea leaves of various statements that some of your colleagues have made, including Dr. Mara Karlin, who talked to us about what we should expect in the next national defense strategy, she referred to the fact that there's going to be a focus on China in the next NDS. China is well known as the Department of Defense's pacing challenge. And so for years, we've heard from, defense experts really trying to warn that a potential future conflict with China is going to look markedly different than any of the conflicts that the US military has fought over the past 20 years or so. So I'm really curious as to how the China challenge is impacting readiness and force readiness today. What is it that we're doing to prepare the force to be more prepared for a potential future conflict with China, which we obviously don't want to happen, but part of deterrence is having capable forces. So how is it that we are better preparing our forces to contend with that challenge in the future?
The thing we deal with all the time is what's referred to in Deputy Secretary Hicks herself wrote about it some time ago, it is the iron triangle of readiness. Operational readiness, ready for today. Force structure, how do you want to align and organize and equip your forces? And modernization, pursuing new equipment and capabilities and then inserting them into that force structure. The China Challenge, which is a near-peer, potentially all-domain competition, everything from cyber to space to air, sea, undersea, land, are capabilities that we hadn't had to bring to bear over the previous 2 decades. So the capabilities that we arrived with just a few years ago are not the ones that are truly applicable and best suited to what we think we need in the years ahead. So we have to be able to assume risk in different forms. How much resourcing do you put into the pursuit of new capabilities and then new acquisition programs? How many forces do you apply to essentially pull out of the rotation for deployment at any one time to receive those modern capabilities or restructuring that's available to be done in the near term, thereby taking them out of the rotation to be available for the operational readiness part of the triangle in that way. And then all of it is a zero-sum game. It doesn't matter what the top line is, which is a constant competition. So is there a magic number? I'm not sure that there is. Are some top line numbers better than others? Everyone has their perspective on what that means, but there's always the decision has to be made as to where does it go today, tomorrow, and for what? Even when you decide how much it goes to, what does it go to? Does all your operational money go into maintenance or operations? Does it go into training time? Does it go into pursuing new technologies or acquiring technologies you believe have a reasonable degree of success, and that can be brought to some degree of scale that's appropriate for fielding and actually becoming a live capability within the force? That's what the senior leaders get the really big bucks for.
Yeah, and so I will just shamelessly plug one of my own reports, Risky Business, that I wrote with my colleagues, Stacy Pettyjohn and Jenny Machushik. We went after the different requirements for force structure, modernization, and linked to different future defense strategies, all with a very different top line. So if you're interested in some of what Ms. Skelly just referred to, I would definitely give that a read, just in case folks are interested. As I said, shameless plug for my own stuff. But you started to get at some of the tension between making choices to better prepare for the future that sometimes have implications for today. And I think an area where we see this happen the most tends to be with emerging crises. So while China may perhaps be this, next focus of the future national defense strategy, right now we're seeing Russia reminding us that it still poses a pretty significant challenge. We've seen the rather intense military buildup near Ukraine, and we've already seen an impact on the joint force. I believe it's 3,000 troops have been or are going to be deployed to Poland. There's 3,000 deployed to Poland and Romania, and about 8,500 on prepared to deploy orders. And so this really gets to the heart of what I see as the readiness challenge, which is trying to meet the demands of the emerging crises while still trying to preserve readiness for future challenges. So how is it that you're trying to manage the current crisis in Europe and really thinking about ways in which we can make sure that, we don't shake that Russian bear too much and still keep readiness in mind?
Well, Becca, anytime a crisis arrives that requires an additional commitment of forces for whatever reason. Right now, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, we're meeting our NATO commitments. This is about our allies, where these forces are going. It's about assurance and deterrence. We have force structure and we have global force management policies that make different types of forces available for deployment on different time frames. Many of the forces that are moving today are ones that were pretty much in the hopper to go if a crisis arrived at any one time. That's how we build the forces every year, starting over a year ahead of time to let us know what we want each year. significant amount of consultation and planning goes into what is the right mix, because we're always trying to satisfy the governing national defense strategy, national military strategy at that time, in accordance with the national security strategy that's predominant at that time. So we don't have to think too hard about what we're supposed to do, but then it's how do you satisfy that and what do you satisfy it with, and make them available at a particular moment in time, which changes, evolves as we move through a year. Forces may not need, another unit may replace them in needing to be ready for an on-call commitment sometimes. Sometimes it's forces that we're preparing to deploy somewhere else, and therefore they are ready to go, but they're not going to go where they were originally planned. And then that becomes a conversation and an understanding of what happens with not meeting that originally planned commitment, perhaps in another combatant command AOR for a particular purpose. And that's where we have to go in the future with regard to getting a more analytically captured understanding of the impacts of those decisions. If you deploy something now earlier, or keep something out there, keep a unit out there longer, what are the implications down the road? Do they miss an opportunity to modernize that's awaiting them? Does that shake up the Congo line that was waiting for new folks to get into, say, a shipyard, which is often pretty dominant for Navy planning? The availability, ships have to come out of the water every several years. Ships have to be pierside for extended periods of time to get maintenance, because they wear down pretty well when you put them to sea for long periods of time. All of those things come into play. What happens if we move from one combatant command that was originally planned to another? Have we just taken the bottom out of a major exercise program in that AOR, which is supposed to not only help assure our partners, but build their capabilities as we campaign with regard to our desired defense posture in any part of the world? All of those things come into play today. Our goal is to understand them even better, what the implications of those decisions are in the future, because it goes all the way down to the money you're going to have to spend to turn that squadron or that wing or that carrier group back around and make them ready to go at another point in the horizon. And is that different where you were planning it for, based on what you're presently doing?
So I'm going to get back to the data analytics part in a little bit, because I definitely want to hear more about that. But, I think you've mentioned, this kind of trade-off across combatant commands with some of the crisis response forces that you have. And I think it's worth noting that right now, as we have this, crisis in Europe, there's also ongoing exercises that are happening largely in the Indo-Pacific. I think Pacific Defender is occurring right now. And there's also been continued force deployments to the Middle East. We've seen the USS Cole and F-22s head toward the UAE to help, again, for that, reassurance and deterrence element. So with all of this going on, there has to be some type of global rack and stack. And I really want to ask you about, how is it that you're trying to find better ways of creating that prioritization and trying to deal with that over time? Because it seems to me the largest challenge is managing readiness across time.
It's about risk. It's about risk understanding to enable senior leader risk acceptance. And sometimes we can have a plan for a deliberate acceptance of risk, perhaps lowering a planned commitment to a region of the world, to a combatant command AOR. But then a crisis will come up that demands attention in that part of the world, which will take either forces away from where they're otherwise planned to be, or require forces to be moved forward and deployed if they can be made suitably ready for that requirement, and put them out there when we hope to have them home, not just for their own modernization or their own, frankly, the rest. We can't forget the people aspect of things. And I know my DASD force education and training right now is waiting when I was going to say people. But it's also about the people and the demands that are on them and their families. And that upsets the apple cart as well. The best laid plans are often upset, but we have to understand the risks that are involved and how that echoes across our plans. Sometimes moving forces takes them away from planned experimentation and exercises, because it's also TTP development, training, tactics, techniques, and procedures require actual exercising of forces, as well as sometimes tech demonstrations and evaluations require the operational forces to be involved in those things, and they all get upset by that. or perturbated.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really good point. And, I would be remiss in not noting that, not all challenges to readiness are external, right? We do have some internal challenges for readiness, which are training, as you mentioned, and also the health and well-being of soldiers. I also heard you kind of refer a little bit to risk acceptance, and it seems as though there's that you're perhaps moving towards creating a strategy to risk framework for assessing readiness, which love to hear a little bit more about. But to our audience, I just want to remind you to please keep your questions coming. I'm seeing some great ones already, and we're going to be shifting soon to asking those questions. So again, you can just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And again, just please remember to identify yourself along with your question. So I want to now shift to talking a little bit about how the Department of Defense can better address the challenges that you laid out by making some concrete changes. One of the biggest readiness, truths, if you will, is that the force can't be ready for everything. We talked about this. It can only be ready for some things. And then that perennial question that you started off with, readiness for what, really comes up. Rather, what is it that we want to train and prepare the force for? So what is it that we are preparing the force to be ready for? And what are the biggest changes that we're making to enable that? I think you've hinted at a few of them already, but would love for you to just elucidate it a little bit more.
Thanks, Becca. Well, a lot of it comes to the guests that preceded me in this series, my colleague, Dr. Carlin, and the National Defense Strategy, which will hopefully be forthcoming soon. That sets the what, but it's been stated since the start of this administration, a little over a year ago, that China is the pacing challenge that'll drive how the department looks at the future and how it gets ready for the future in the broadest, most amorphous definition of ready. I think perhaps it's the technologies that are required, those 20 years that we have not spent modernizing at the top end. Fifth generation, we use the fighter term applicable to the force writ large often. The fifth generation technologies that are out there, we know that it's the pursuit of technologies leading to capabilities such as hypersonics, space capabilities, command and control, AI. But really, I think what underpins all that, we have a lot of technological work to do, infrastructure to support the technological development and eventual acquisition. We really have to get our people into that as well, which the department is striving to do. While China is the pacing challenge, and we need to understand what our people need to know with regard to that challenge, we also have to make sure that they're ready for whatever comes their way. Because if we can meet that pacing challenge, we should be able to handle most of the things that are below that that very high-end threshold. We're in a very good conversation that's just really starting with Congress as to military education, what value that brings and why, and how do we modernize it? How do we get better at educating people and preparing them to learn continually throughout their career? How do we create senior leaders that'll be able to adapt to these challenges? I don't think I need a 3.5 million person total force that can all speak Mandarin in order to meet the pacing challenge of China. We certainly do need some people with some real, high demand, low density, so to speak, skills, AI, cyber, analytics, some other disciplines, which require a form of exquisite talent management. How do we ensure they're optimized through their career as uniformed service members? How do we acquire those people, assess them into the force? How do we get civilians with those skills in? How do we create mobility so that they can refresh their talents, come back? How can we get mid-career people? I believe there's just an article somewhere in the Defense News Early Bird, I think today, about the Marine Corps making some decisions as to how it'll pull in mid-career people and still, keep them, make them Marines at the same time. Those are significant challenges that have real implications for us because our old systems, our older inherited systems of personnel are not as adaptive, and we're not holding on to people that we put a lot of effort into to make high-end, high-skilled talent. That's going to be as critical as anything else, which is why I, as the Assistant Secretary for Readiness, reside in personnel and readiness because the two are practically inextricable. We can't lose sight of the criticality of people, and people in terms of their time away from home and back, whether they're part of the reserve component, and what that means for their mobilization and how long they've been away, and is a core component of what we look at when we deploy. It's not just what type of capability compared to a challenge. It's about, there's a people aspect to it as well.
So I think you're getting at this kind of more holistic view of readiness. And there's really been a push that I think we've heard a little bit more of in recent years, but this push to redefine how readiness is measured. Generals Brown and Berger have really made a case for distinguishing between readiness and capability, while others have said readiness is much more holistic and you need to look at inputs as well as outputs. So are you looking at new ways of measuring readiness? Will we see these changes reflected in the Defense Readiness Reporting System? Are you trying to incorporate data and new data analytics into how you're measuring readiness? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
So a simple yes to all won't suffice, no, but the answer is yes to all. The centrality of people and their individual performance grows by the year, as well as our understanding that it's not just the service member, but it's their family that impacts their individual ability to be ready, to train, to perform in their specialty as part of their unit, and for that unit to be ready to go. Starts with how we take care of the service member and their family. That's an imperative, because when we assess somebody, generally our cost return on investment is when they stay as long as they want to feel welcome and successful and taken care of. And we get the best bang for our buck with regard to people when that happens. It's very expensive to lose somebody before they've matured in their specialty and before they've served their country to the maximum extent that they want to. And if they leave dissatisfied, that's a big hurt to our ability to get more people to join the all-volunteer force. In that way, it's pretty critical. But with regard to how we measure readiness, the future is so bright, we have to wear shades in respect. It's all about data analytics. It's about modeling. There's an analytic community that's burgeoning across the Department of Defense. I'm not a tech person, but I have great respect for it. I think it's somewhat akin to what it was back in my day over 20 years ago, how coding broke out all over the service, and then hackathons and the early, what I'd call, what we currently recognize as innovation, and is innovation which is still blooming across the services at the grassroots, the ground level, the tactical level, and units, that the services have their own programs for how to capture. It's much like, how do you hold on to a baby bird just enough so you don't crush it, to let it flourish and create innovative progress in that way. And that's where we're at with analytics. My team, the Force Readiness team, they're doing a great job helping it serve as an organizing central focus to bring together a burgeoning community of practice, because there are so many analytic efforts going out there, not just at the military service levels, but in units and commands that are out there where they're trying to solve and are solving and generating effect on so many problems. What we're looking to do, we have our own model going here in close cooperation with the Marine Corps, called the Readiness Decision Impact Model, RDIM, where we're trying to take all the data we can get a hold of, whether it be sustainment data, how much it costs and how much effort it is to make a plane, a squadron, a ship, a brigade ready to go, couple that with what it takes to train them, how eventually even get in climate data, weather patterns, and how that impacts training availabilities and the like, and understand when you put input X, which means making them deploy earlier or longer or go, how does that play out over time? What does that do to cost? What does that do to what we understand as readiness, and what portion of readiness are we talking about in that way? The future of the Defense Readiness Reporting System, or DRS, I think that's going to be with us for a while, because it's a major program. It encompasses the entire Department of Defense to let senior leadership, service leadership, and joint and OSD leadership know what's the status of any individual unit in the force at a period in time. But going forward, I think the home for that is in the analytic layer that the Joint AI Center, which is soon to become part of, if not already part of, the Chief digital and AI officer, which is combining CDO, digital officer, with analytics and executive analytics and the like, all coming together. We have to take readiness reporting into the future, into that analytic AI plane that provides access department-wide. It can't be an app on a single place. It has to be a shared understanding of readiness in the future based wholly on analytical modeling.
That's great, and that's wonderful to hear. And I'm so glad to hear that some of the data is being incorporated in a way that will hopefully help some of the decisions that we need to make about readiness, but to also just give a more fuller picture of some of the readiness demands as well. Speaking of readiness demands, I want to shift to talking a little bit about global force management. Over the past few years, it's become apparent that the global force management process isn't exactly working as designed. There's some arguments that the process itself is broken and has been exploited by the combatant commands, while some other folks tend to trace it to the overwhelming global demands on a finite number of forces and capabilities. Either way, I think we can say that there's been an impact on force readiness from constant deployment cycles. So are there changes being made to the global force management process with the aim to improve readiness?
We're always looking at global force management in terms of the process as well as the impacts of the decisions that we make. I think it'd be a little premature for me to talk about what changes might be in the offing, but all of the factors that you just described are ones that we're very aware of. It's a lengthy process. We're always in the middle of it, or we're always involved in it. It's just what point in that recurring cyclical process that we're at that makes units available, eventually makes units available. It starts with the national defense strategy, the military strategy, what the combatants commands believe they need, what forces will be assigned to them, what forces will be deployed to them, and then what will be made ready based on what we think the threats and or risks are at a time. And then life gets in the way and things happen. And the best laid plans, I won't say they go awry, but they have to be adjusted. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we all understand that all too well. Oh, go on. So sorry to speak over you.
Perhaps the best value of a plan, it's a commonly shared appreciation that you then depart from when things happen.
And so I want to ask you about a related process. And so that's the SDOB process, which is the process by which combatant commander requests are requests for forces. They're validated and they're sourced, and the deployments are authorized by the Secretary of Defense. How is it that you're trying to incorporate this strategic readiness perspective into the SDOB process, which I think right now we can say is quite relevant?
So for folks at home who don't have the pleasure of it, SDOB stands for the Secretary of Defense's Orders Book, which is essentially how forces are brought to the Secretary's attention and recommendation for him to approve for them to move if they weren't already programmed and planned for to move within a year, if this would be something new that wasn't planned for, say, fiscal year 2022. Predictive modeling would be central to it in terms of understanding the implications of moving any one unit, because anything that would come up to the Secretary through that process would be something that wasn't pre-planned at that time. For instance, forces that are moving towards Europe today as part of our NATO commitments, many of those were ordered to do so, in order to prepare to do so if required, through that process. And every one of those goes through where the combatant command, the services, if they're not already on the list, to be the first ones to go. Any other deeper ones we have to go deeper into the jar, so to speak. Then the services will talk about the implications of them. Combatant commands will talk about the impacts upon them where pertinent, and all of those things are captured. Then the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary for Policy, my boss, the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. So I'm responsible, my team is responsible for that final recommendation from the Personnel and Readiness side, as well as the General Counsel and Intelligence and Security, all make, along with the chairman, who brings it all together and puts it in front of the Secretary, all weigh in with what they think about the offered forces for deployment. with a concur, non-concur, and the like, and what we think the factors are in there that the secretary should be aware of. And I think that's where all these predictive and these modeling and these analytic efforts are going, is to deepen and hopefully sharpen the appreciation that the secretary will have of what is at stake, not to be fraught about it, but just what the implications are of moving a unit or force or capability that wasn't previously planned for that purpose, and just what it means. Sometimes it can be relatively simple, not always, but hey, they were prepared. They were prepared for this year. They knew they might go someplace. They go. A lot of times it's about extending capabilities and they were okay when they left because they were prepared to go someplace in case. Now we're wanting to keep them even longer. What does that then mean? Or there might not have been a lot of question on the front end. There could be questions later on. And it's always understanding what that means down the road. I think we do a really good job today. It's advanced from where it was in years past when I had a viewpoint on these things, and certainly much more advanced when I was subject to them myself in a squadron in an aircraft carrier strike group. But we can get better because we know these things truly ripple over time. And as our forces become smaller, where the implications become bigger, where the modernization challenges become ever greater, we have to know these. We have to know as much as we possibly can to provide that to the secretary for his ability to make a decision and understand the risk.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that. I think folks don't always know how complex the process for deciding some of these deployments truly is, and how difficult it can be. And it's great to hear the ways in which you are improving that process and trying to incorporate more of the data and the analytics that you have and think about how we're going to be doing this into the future. Speaking of future, I want to talk about technology, which isn't necessarily a thing of the future anymore, but I always think of future tech when I say technology. But usually when we're talking about new technology, we just kind of automatically assume that it's going to be capabilities that we would see in the field. But there are ways in which the DoD is currently harnessing technology to improve training. And with some of the right technologies, we could, in theory, simulate training that soldiers need in order to recoup readiness or to become more ready when they happen to be in some of these lower readiness situations. So could you talk a little bit more about how you're leveraging technology in some of the training efforts that you're leading to improve readiness?
Thanks, Beckett. Without training, there is no readiness. And every time you make a unit ready, its readiness will almost automatically begin to degrade in some form or fashion. You might not see it very much, but over time, it will degrade. That could even be in a prepare to deploy status because you can't unpack your stuff enough to go do things, just to go to a range or do whatever you need to do. But we always understand that they'll stay ready enough over time. But oftentimes when you go, from my personal experience in a strike group, literally going to the other side of the world, the kind of training that you did to achieve that, what we call C1, full ready for all your assigned missions, were done on ranges with capabilities, and usually some of the weapons that you would actually use, or the training version of those weapons on instrumented ranges and the like, perhaps even with threat emitters and threat simulators involved. You do those before you then actually deploy. But then when you go deploy, those things are normally not available to you. Sometimes there's a lesser version of it in a partner or allied country. Sometimes there's nothing. And next thing you know, you're dropping little practice bombs on something that's literally dragged behind the aircraft carrier at 3/4 of a mile with little smoke charges. And you're just practicing things, essentially falling off the airplane and seeing if you can hit the water with it. Not quite the same. Do you get a little readiness upgrade that your aircraft can actually drop something and you drop something successfully off of it? Yes. Is that what we'd call as ready as you were when you left 3 months prior? No. But that was the nature of the beast. Today, it's about systems being built with training capabilities ready for them. The services have the lion's share of that responsibility. What we do up at the Office of Secretary of Defense is try to ensure, in partnership with the Joint Staff, that these things, all of these new training capabilities, which include augmented reality, virtual reality, the combination of live, virtual, and constructive opportunities, things that might be resonant in a weapon system or a platform or something that you can utilize in, say, even a laptop, or potentially do you get some training value out of something that's handheld, what we used to call back in the day a partial task. You should just be understanding something or playing with one particular replication of a box that's in your system, something like that. All those things are sort of the same, but also generations advanced now. We need to assure that any one platform that's supposed to operate with other platforms in the real world, that those training capabilities, as best as capable and desirable, are able to interact with each other. That if I'm sitting in a simulator at NAS Oceana, I can fight with, fly alongside, or go beak to beak in fighter talk with folks in an F-22 simulator at Langley across the water, or somebody on the other side of the country or the other side of the world, and in some cases with our allied partners in that way that might share similar or like capabilities. Bringing all those together so that they not only work, that they're realistic, that they could be transportable, deployable, relocatable, but also that we have to ensure that they're joint to the maximum extent possible, so that whatever we're going to do in the real world, we're preparing for that all along the way. I don't envy the challenge, but I think it's fascinating that that leaders today have to go through to always look at that balance of how much do you actually have to drive, shoot, and fly in the real world, and how much value can you get out of the various types of simulated capability, and at what level, and sort of the building block process to a capability to be able to not only achieve those effects in the real world, but to operate and do those things safely to begin with. It's a continual balance. It takes both real training and education to understand it, but also it's always about leadership at the end of the day.
One of my colleagues, Jenny McCardle, is working on a project here at CNAS called A New American Way of Training, in which she's definitely looking at how some of those technologies could be leveraged to improve training over time and to improve readiness of our forces. So it sounds very much in line with what you had just talked about. And so I'm going to just have one last question for me before we switch to questions from the audience. And it's one about implementation, because all of these changes that we just talked about, they're not possible if you don't have the resources for them. You started off by mentioning the iron triangle of painful trade-offs, right? So how is it that you balance readiness, modernization, and force structure? You know, those tend to be the major resource buckets. And that iron triangle of painful trade-offs is at its most painful when it comes down to, you know, budgeting and identifying the resources that you want to spread across all of those. So I know that this is a bit of a perennial question, but how do we fund readiness? And what are some of the hard decisions that we may need to make when it comes down to prioritizing the parts of readiness that are most important?
I know when we started out and you asked me the definition of readiness, and I said the answer are questions. This time I'm going to flip it around and take another oversimplistic whack at it. I think from this perspective, readiness is everything. We're not going to be ready if we're not pursuing technology, which the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering has to do. We're not going to be ready if our acquisition and sustainment programs aren't optimally performing to actually get things to arrive on time when they're predicated, when they're asked for, when they're expected, to be able to do the force structure we want, and alongside the modernization that we need. We're not going to be ready if we can't afford to keep those things on the ramp, driving, flying, sailing in that way. It involves that too. We're not going to be ready if we can't get out and have training ranges that will support those systems. A lot of the things that we're doing now are generations beyond what our current training infrastructure supports in terms of physical ranges, such as to fly in and for weapon systems to be shot when required or even practiced. You know, in the real world, we expect, for instance, tactical fighters, fifth generation fighters, to be tens and 100 miles apart in some cases and cooperating with each other and doing those things. Are we only ever going to do that in simulation, or are there times when we need to practice that for real? And over which half of the United States are we going to do that in, and how do you do that safely and get value out of it at the same time? So it's really about everything. And the way we have to pursue everything is to understand them to the maximal extent possible, and then link them and understand and begin to try and appreciate how they understand and bring that to the fore when the ultimate senior leader decisions are being made across the Department of Defense, not just the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but alongside the military departments, the services, and the joint staff. I have the pleasure, the privilege to often represent my boss in many of those sorts of meetings run by the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And it could be on anything from AI to test and evaluation infrastructure to innovation workforce to just the budget meetings. And my note hand gets crampy from all the times like, ooh, that's us, that connects to the modeling work we're doing, heads up training and education and training, heads up safety and occupational health, which is one of my shops, because these all have implications in there. It's about, we have to get so much better at understanding what we do so that the decisions we made are informed. They're very rarely, one decision will rule them all and fix everything. We work with Congress. Congress gives us the budget. Congress tells us what we can spend the budget on, and the amount of decision space we have after that's done sometimes isn't a lot. And a lot of it is how we interact with Congress before a particular budget year or a budget cycle to set the why and the understanding as to why we want to do X with Y amount of money and why we'd like it right now, please, or why we also need it a little further down the road. That is imperative to being ready as well, because it's the executive branch and the legislative branch working together in order for the Department of Defense to do the things it's tasked to do.
So we're now going to switch to questions from the audience, and I'm going to try and get through as many as possible because we've got some great questions here, and there's even more coming in that I keep on seeing. So we'll try and hit as many as we can and sort of keep everything sort of tight and brief so we can get through all of them. So let me start off with a question from Kelly. Due to heightened tension in Eastern Europe due to Russian military buildup near Ukraine, might we see a shift or an increase in our European deployed forces? And what are the implications for the Indo-PACOM region?
Thanks, Kelly. That's a great question. How do I answer without getting in trouble? But honestly, Russia is a formidable country in terms of its capabilities, and especially those that are arrayed across Ukraine's borders right now. And because of that, because we are part of NATO and we're responding in support of our freestanding commitments with our NATO allies, some forces are moving there. I don't know what the future may bring as a result of what's happening today and what could happen in the days and weeks ahead. I would say that within the realm of the possible, of course that's possible, because it's always about protecting our allies as part of the alliance we're in. That's what NATO's about. So I wouldn't begin to speculate, but would anything that happened in the European theater affect the Pacific theater? The Indo-Pacific theater, excuse me, I'm old, I served in Pacific Command. Yes, it's a zero-sum game, always. At some level, at some point, it's a zero-sum game. We consider explicitly China to be the pacing challenge, and we would like to orient our forces to the Pacific theater. It's where the predominance of the world's economy moves through and from, the world's population, the theater of the future. It's been described as for quite some time. But there's also the exigencies and the realities of crises or challenges of a moment. So that would be possible, and we'd have to adjust. And that's what leadership gets paid to do, is to react and adjust in accordance with the directives of the White House and the president.
So another question that's kind of getting at a different element of what that zero-sum game tends to be across some of the regions is a question from Robert. Services build readiness, combatant commands consume readiness. What is your role at Office of the Secretary of Defense in helping to manage the tension between the services and the combatant commands as it pertains to readiness?
Well, I wouldn't forget the role of the Joint Staff in that. And the Joint Staff helps coordinate the combatant command's requirements and what's asked of the services, but ultimately the Office of the Secretary of Defense, because the Secretary is in charge, and we have to understand those competing demands and make sure that those implications are made available to the Secretary when decisions are put before him as to posture decisions, as to what forces are assigned to what theater and why. We make recommendations on that along with the Joint Staff. The Chairman's recommendations and the services positions are known. So it's understanding that that's what the Office of the Secretary of Defense exists to do, to understand these things, because the span of control, the scope is so deep that the Secretary, that which the Secretary is responsible for, is that we have to bring that understanding into all those decisions that are put before him.
So we have another question, also from a Robert. Don't know if it's the same Robert, about your relationship to the Joint Staff as it pertains to measuring readiness and trying to assess risk. So how does your office work with the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Joint Staff in measuring and looking at readiness?
Very closely. Actually, my Deputy Assistant Secretary for Force Readiness just held one of her recurring meetings with partners in the Joint Staff and the services, as well as other parts of the Office of the Secretary of Defense. We have a robust, routine, continuing relationship with them and understanding what that is. The execution of global force management in terms of bringing those forces together that the services make available to meet the demands, the Joint Staff makes that go. We own the global force management policies. They help to bring it all together. The services train and equip the forces to be put into that process. It's a very cooperative, close relationship.
So speaking of cooperative and close relationships, we have an allies and partners question. So this comes from Sang Min. What do you think about resuming large-scale field-based exercises in the U.S.-South Korea joint military exercises to enhance readiness? So essentially, a question that's asking a little bit about how is it that the United States can work with its allies and partners in terms of exercising to improve readiness?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, and one that really starts within the theater that's relevant. In this case, it would be the Pacific Command AOR and our commander in Korea. That way, I know anything that happens on the peninsula is considered in relationship to the situation between the Republic of Korea and North Korea at all times, and what our exercise and operational posture in there is always taken into account as to how that interacts with how North Korea is acting at that time. So I don't think that's done from on high down top. It's not something me and my team, I'm directly involved in. However, those recommendations are made by the commanders in the region for execution by the forces in the region with the support of and or approval of the Office of the Secretary of Defense as appropriate.
So we have a question that is looking at, from Kelly, that is looking at how unmanned systems will impact readiness. So this is very specific about various platforms, but I think there's a broader question in there, which is how is it that we can shift from looking at manned platforms like future fighters and bomber platforms to begin to shift to unmanned systems and the impact on readiness that shifting to unmanned systems might have?
That's a great question, and one that I am looking personally to get further knowledgeable about and have conversations with some of the folks leading many of those efforts related to unmanned and eventually possibly autonomous systems. We know in the current and most recent generation of those systems, we haven't really garnered a great personnel savings from a lot of them. It takes people to deploy, for instance, Reapers and Predators, to launch them, recover them, to process the information that they gather, those things. So the people cost isn't going away anytime soon. And we can never forget it's people that determine the requirements for these systems. It's people that go through that help design and build them, the acquisition process, the test process. It's people-centric all the way through. A lot of it has to do with removing people from the actual point of threat or risk, but there's still a lot of people involvement through the thing. And actually, in some cases, the demand for more technically skilled people actually goes up, and they become a little bit more critical, even if they do go down in numbers. But at the same time, the readiness benefit we may hopefully eventually get from those will be to create them in numbers because generally they're hoped to be less expensive than manned systems with like capabilities or crewed systems with like capabilities. And they're also potentially expected to be more risk accepting, or will accept putting them to more risky situations, such as things as loyal wingmen, more drone-like things that accompany manned tactical aircraft, for example, or unmanned or uncrewed surface or undersea vessels can go probably farther or stay longer in, so to speak, harm's way than you might want to do with a crewed vessel. But the maturity of those technologies isn't quite there yet, though they are considered a potential force multiplier. Just where that horizon is and when you can start to count on that in terms of those risk calculations and looking at future readiness with that modeling that we've mentioned in this conversation, and understanding, so when's fruit going to come off of that tree? Because we've been betting on it to come in that way, because how long are we going to keep cruisers alive or destroyers alive, et cetera? And these unmanned things may help fill those gaps or actually expand our capabilities in some places. I would say unknown, but it's something we'd very much like to bring to bear and understand when we could count on it.
So another future-oriented question comes from Susan. In what ways might global climate change affect strategic readiness? Are there particular areas that may see large impacts?
That is a great question, and one that very much, in some respect, resides right in my shop's wheelhouse. Both my force readiness, my force education and training, and even my force safety and occupational health eventually has a part of that. And we're beginning to study that right now. Because frankly, we don't have a good handle as to how what we now call climate, or think of in the construct of climate, has impacted us over the last couple of decades, as storms get a little bit more unpredictable in terms of their frequency, in terms of the periods of the year that they occur, the severity that they happen with. We know that in just the last handful of years, major bases have been impacted significantly. I think it was Offutt Air Force Base flooded out lost a runway for a period of time. Tyndall Air Force Base got hit with a tropical storm. We're always worried about what the increasing severity and length of wildfire season in different parts of the Western United States have, which change availability of operational capabilities, training capabilities. With the F-22 program was impacted because a significant training capability for that platform was resident at Tyndall, and they had to distribute it, reconstitute it, and they did the Lord's work in getting through that, but it was a significant displacement of capabilities. We don't know right now how many training days we lose to weather. We just get through it. It happens at the tactical level, which small unit leaders have always been good at and always been able to make happen. But we're starting a study to understand how we can capture that without unduly burdening the force, because we're not asking them to become climate predictors, just weather observers that can then factor into and feed the big climate efforts behind them in the larger enterprise. But we know the Arctic is changing. The Arctic's a domain that we want to have more capability in because other actors are exerting themselves in. We know different parts of the world, the climate's changing, getting hotter. That makes it harder to operate in, less friendly to operate in. We know that sea levels are changing and the like. We definitely have an eye towards it, and we're trying to understand it and bring it into our considerations as how we shape the force and how it will be needed to operate in the future.
So I think that's all the time we have for questions. Again, there's been so many great ones. I'm so sorry that I couldn't get to them all. But before we let you go back to your very busy schedule, Ms. Skelly, could you please recap what today's mission brief was for the audience?
Thanks, Becca. So the Department of Defense is at an inflection point. There's so much change ongoing and so much more change is required. We have an opportunity to capitalize on that momentum and affect a change towards the appreciation of strategic readiness, where data modeling and predictive analytics can be brought to bear to really increase our understanding of risks and offsets over time, to be able to bring that into play to provide senior leaders with an enterprise level of decision advantage in order to pursue our strategic capabilities and objectives.
Thank you for that and for a fantastic discussion on strategic readiness. We're really so honored that you were able to join us in today's Mission Brief event. And to the audience, thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for more on the Mission Brief events. We have another conversation this month, toward the end of the month, I believe the 22nd of February, that is scheduled with Lieutenant General John Jensen, who's the Director of the Army National Guard. So we're going to be sending out an invitation for that soon. But until next time, folks.